my lazy parents found out my salary. Instead of congratulating me, they came to demand 50% of my monthly income. I gave them an envelope, and what was inside left them speechless. I couldn't believe it. I'd been waiting for this moment for so long, the moment when I could finally breathe easy, when my hard work would pay off. It had taken years of late nights, studying on crowded buses, missing out on normal weekends and vacations. But today it had finally happened. I had made it. I stared at the promotion email on my phone, reading the words over and over. Senior financial analyst. The email felt like it was written for someone else, like it wasn't even mine to open, but there it was, real and in front of me. The rush of excitement surged through my chest. My hands were shaking as I set my phone down, standing there for a few seconds, letting the reality settle in. I could almost hear the future opening up in front of me, wide and full of potential. But then, my doorbell rang. I froze. It was nearly 8 in the evening. No one ever came by this late unless something was wrong. I walked over to the door, half expecting to see a delivery guy with some food I didn't remember ordering. But when I opened it, I wasn't ready for what I saw. There stood my parents. My mother, always the first to show up at any moment of my life, stood there with her practiced smile, the one she used when she wanted something. It didn't reach her eyes, not that I expected it to. Behind her, my dad was standing with his hands jammed into his jacket pockets, his eyes scanning the apartment like it was some kind of inventory. "Hi, sweetheart," my mom said. Her voice too sweet, like she was trying to cover something up. She didn't even come in, just handed me a small, cheap cake in a plastic box. "We brought this to celebrate," she added, as if they'd done something to deserve it. I took it and stepped aside to let them in, trying to push down the uneasy feeling that was creeping up on me. Something about this wasn't right. We went to the kitchen table, and I sat down across from them, trying to stay composed. I wasn't sure how to act around them anymore. All those years of constant guilt and their demands had left a kind of fog over any joy I could have felt today. They were always trying to make me feel like I owed them something, even now, at 28 years old, with a successful career in front of me. So, my mom started, sitting down, a little too comfortably for someone who was supposedly just here to celebrate. "Your salary went up quite a bit. Must be nice," she added, staring at me like she was already calculating something. I was taken aback. She hadn't even asked how I felt, didn't even pretend to care. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's been a lot of work, but I earned it." Dad let out a low whistle, nodding approvingly but with that same underlying tone I'd heard too many times before. "You're doing well, Jess? Better than us. And after everything we've done." He let the sentence hang there, like a piece of bait waiting for me to bite. I could feel the tension building in my chest, but I kept my calm. The pattern was familiar. This wasn't a congratulation. This was a transaction. This was them coming to collect. "Actually," Mom leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table as if we were discussing a bill, "we think it's fair, that you contribute to the household." She paused, her smile stretching thin, and then dropped the bomb. 50% of your monthly income, just until we get back on our feet." I stared at her, my heart pounding. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. 50% of my salary. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, I took a deep breath, forcing the shock and anger back down. "That's not how this works," I finally said, my voice quiet but firm. Mom's expression didn't change. She just kept staring at me with that same disarming smile. "Sweetheart," she said like she was speaking to a child, "don't be dramatic. Families support each other. Support goes both ways," I replied, pushing back against the pressure. I could feel my shoulders tighten. Years of being told I owed them something, of being guilted doing things I didn't want to do, were flashing through my mind in a rush. I felt it all, the resentment, the frustration, the years of silently giving in, but I couldn't give in anymore, not this time. Mom scoffed. "We raised you, fed you, gave you a roof over your head. You wouldn't be where you are without us." There it was. The old script. The words I'd heard countless times before. The words they always used when they needed something. But this time, it didn't sit right. It didn't hold the same power over me as it once had. And then I understood. This wasn't a request. This wasn't even a conversation. It was a collection call, and I wasn't their debtor anymore. I didn't owe them anything. I sat back in my chair, staring across the table at them, the same table I had worked overtime to afford. The same table they'd never once helped me buy, move, or assemble. I had done all of this myself. And it was time for me to stop paying for their mistakes. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. My parents were sitting across from me, still looking at me with that same air of entitlement. The silence between us was thick, heavy with unspoken expectations. "You can't seriously think I'm going to give you 50% of my salary," I said, trying to keep my voice even. But inside, I felt the heat rising in my cheeks. How had it come to this? I had worked so hard for this moment, climbing my way up the corporate ladder, staying late at the office, sacrificing weekends and holidays, not to mention the endless hours spent buried in spreadsheets and reports. And now, the one moment I thought I could truly enjoy, when I could finally see the fruits of all that labor, had been overshadowed by this. By them. My mother's smile didn't falter. She leaned in a little closer, eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge my response. "You know, Toby," she said in that soothing, practiced tone, the one she used when she was about to manipulate me. "We've always supported you. You wouldn't be where you are without us. All we're asking is for you to help us a little. 50% is nothing compared to what we've done for you." I could feel my blood start to boil. "What you've done for me," I echoed, trying to keep the words from sounding too harsh. But I was already losing the battle. "You've never supported me, Mom. Not really. You've kept me in debt. Every meal, every school form, every time you called me to send money because you didn't know how to manage your finances. That's not support. That's manipulation." Dad shifted in his seat, the chair creaking beneath him. He didn't look at me, but I could feel his eyes burning into the side of my face. "Don't talk to your mother like that," he said, his voice low and rough, a warning. I swallowed hard, trying to hold back the anger that was welling up inside me. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was something deeper, something that had been building for years. All those moments where I'd been told I owed them something, all those times I'd been guilted into doing things for them, to pay back their supposed sacrifices. It was too much. "You raised me," I said slowly, deliberately. "But you didn't raise me to be your personal bank. You raised me to be independent, didn't you? At least, that's what you told me when I left at 18. So why is it now that I'm the one who owes you?" My father scoffed, leaning back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "You make good money now. You've got a stable job. We deserve a little something for all the years we spent looking out for you." His tone was casual, like this was just a normal conversation. But it wasn't. Not for me. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting the urge to get up and leave. But I stayed seated. "No, Dad. You don't deserve anything from me," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "You didn't look out for me. You survived off of me. Every time I did something for you, you kept a tally. Every favor you did wasn't out of love, it was a transaction." Mom's eyes flashed with irritation. She was quiet for a moment, but I could see her working through her response. "Don't be dramatic, Toby," she said finally, in that patronizing way that always made me feel small. "Families support each other. That's what we do. Support goes both ways." I shot back, my voice rising slightly. "And you've been taking from me for years without ever giving anything in return." The room was still, the tension thick. I could feel the years of resentment coming to a boiling point. I had always been the one who gave. Gave my time, gave my money, gave my energy, and now that I had something for myself, they thought it was theirs to take. It was never enough for them. It was never enough for anyone but themselves. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. I didn't want to move too quickly, but I couldn't stay still anymore. "You came here tonight for one reason," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "Not to celebrate me. Not to share in my success. You came here to take. To take from me what you think you deserve." Mom's expression faltered for a second, her hand tightening around the edge of the table, but she quickly masked it with that fake smile of hers. Dad, on the other hand, looked a little less sure of himself. His gaze shifted, like he was suddenly questioning whether he had the upper hand. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. But there was no turning back now, no more, I said firmly. "I'm done giving you what you want, just because you think you're entitled to it." I turned to the counter where I had placed the envelope earlier. It was small and inconspicuous, but it held everything I needed to put an end to this. I took it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the weight of years of manipulation finally coming to an end. Turning back to face them, I held it up. "This," I said, "is everything you've been asking for." I placed it gently on the table between us. Their eyes locked onto it, the tension in the room suddenly shifting. They didn't know it yet, but that moment, this small, quiet act, would change everything. I watched my parents' eyes shift from the envelope to each other, then back to me. There was a flicker of confusion in their expressions. It wasn't what they expected. They had come here ready to take. They thought they had me cornered, that I would fold under the pressure, like I always had in the past. But I wasn't the same person anymore. I stood there, holding my breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around us. The envelope sat between us, like a bomb waiting to go off. My mother's fingers twitched at her sides, but she didn't reach for it. Not yet. She didn't know what was inside, but I could see the way her eyes lingered, calculating. "Open it, Mom," I said quietly, my voice calm, but my heart was thumping hard in my chest. I needed them to see this, to understand that I was done with their demands. I wasn't going to be their ATM anymore. She hesitated, just for a second, before she leaned forward and grabbed the envelope. She tore it open without ceremony, her fingers quick but unsure, like she was afraid of what she might find. My dad watched her, his face tight with impatience. He probably thought this was some sort of trick, a way for me to get back at them. But I didn't need to trick them. I just needed them to face the truth. She pulled out the paper, and I saw her eyes scan the first few lines. Her expression flickered, first confusion, then suspicion. She looked up at me, then back at the paper, her brows furrowing. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low, almost afraid. I didn't respond right away. I wanted them to digest it, to fully understand what they were holding. This wasn't just some piece of paper. This was the document they'd signed years ago, when they had insisted I not be held responsible for their financial mess. I had kept it for years, hidden in a drawer, waiting for the right moment to use it. And now, here we were. "Go ahead," I said, my voice steady. Read it out loud. Mom's hand shook as she flipped through the pages. She tried to hide it, but I saw it. The realization was starting to sink in. They had signed something that gave me legal protection, absolving me of any debt they tried to impose on me. It was like a weight was lifting off my shoulders just watching her struggle to understand. This isn't real," she muttered, her voice wavering now, no longer the confident tone she had used when she walked in. "We didn't sign this. We would never." "You did," I said calmly, cutting her off. 3 years. Remember when you insisted on drawing up a declaration, something to protect my future, as you put it. This is that document." I watched her face change. Her eyes darted across the page, trying to find a loophole, a way to discredit what was in front of her. But there was no escaping it. She had signed it, and so had Dad. You made us sign this." Dad's voice was rough, and for the first time, he sounded uncertain. I could see the anger rising in him, but it wasn't directed at me, not yet. It was directed at himself. He knew deep down that this was his fault. But the denial was still strong. He reached out to take the paper from Mom's hands, but she pulled it away, as if somehow clutching it would make it all go away. "This is ridiculous," Dad muttered, his voice shaking with frustration. He was always good at hiding his emotions, at staying composed, but I could see the cracks starting to form. He was rattled. The truth was finally breaking through that wall of entitlement he had built around himself. I stepped back slightly, allowing them both a moment to process, but I wasn't going to let this drag on any longer. "You didn't just sign this, Mom," I said, leaning in. "You pushed it on me. You told me it was for my own good. But now when it's inconvenient for you, suddenly it's not real." Mom's face flushed a deep red, the words I'd said finally starting to sink in. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with something I couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Anger? Fear? Maybe all of it. But she didn't have time to answer. "Enough," I said. "You wanted 50% of my salary. Well, here's the truth. You don't get to take anything from me, not anymore." I could see them both processing it, their minds scrambling for an answer, but there was nothing they could do. They had no power here. The power was mine now. I let the silence sit between us for a moment, watching as they tried to come to terms with the fact that their plan had failed. But I wasn't finished. I took a deep breath and reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone. I dialed a number, and when the line picked up, I didn't even hesitate. "Dana," I said, "it's time." There was a brief pause on the other end before Dana's voice came through sharp and steady. "Stick to the plan. Let them reveal themselves." I hung up and put the phone back in my pocket, feeling the weight of everything shift in the room. Mom's eyes darted to me again, confusion and suspicion flooding her gaze. "What plan?" she asked, her voice edged with panic. "You'll see," I said softly, the words quiet but final. Mom's hand tightened around the envelope, her knuckles white, as she scanned the paper once more. She was looking for a way out, a way to deny it. But there was no escape. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the door. My parents stiffened, both of them glancing nervously at the door. They weren't expecting anyone. And they certainly weren't expecting what was about to walk through that door. I moved to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened it, I was met with the sight of Dana, standing tall in her sharp coat, followed by an officer who was holding a folder. "Evening," Dana said, her voice calm and professional. "I believe we have some documents for the Hales." The world seemed to freeze as my parents' faces drained of color. They were cornered now. There was no way out. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. "Ma can explain," Mom stammered, trying to back away. But the officer stepped forward, handing her the folder. "You're being served regarding fraudulent evidence submitted in a civil petition and attempts to coerce financial support under false pretenses," the officer said, his tone stern. I watched as the words hit them like a physical blow. They had no words left. They had nothing left. And that was when I realized this was it. This was the moment when everything changed. My life, my freedom, my future, it was all mine now. And they couldn't take it from me. Not anymore. The officer stepped into the room with calm precision, holding the folder like it was just another day at work. My parents looked like they'd just been slapped, their faces pale, mouths opening and closing but not finding the words. The weight of what had just been served was sinking in, and I could see it on their faces, the realization that they were trapped. "You're being served regarding fraudulent evidence submitted in a civil petition and attempts to coerce financial support under false pretenses," the officer said, his voice firm and businesslike. I didn't move. I stood back and let them process it. They had no idea how quickly this was coming. They thought they had control, thought they could manipulate me into submission like they always had before. But not this time. This time, I was in control. This time, they would face the consequences. Mom opened her mouth, her voice shaking. We can explain." It wasn't a question, it was a plea, an attempt to stall. But there was no stalling now. The truth was out. Dad looked from the officer to me, his face tight with disbelief. He seemed to be looking for an escape, his gaze darting around the room, searching for any way out. But there was nothing. There was no way out. The officer didn't flinch. "This is a legal matter," he said simply. "We've gathered all the necessary evidence. This is just the first step." I felt a rush of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the money they thought they could take from me. It was about everything they had done to me over the years, the guilt trips, the emotional manipulation, the endless demands. And now, here they were, the ones who had always seen themselves as the victors, finally facing the truth. Finally being held accountable. Mom looked like she might cry, her eyes welling up, but she clenched her fists and pressed them against her thighs, as if trying to will the situation away. Dad, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to fight. He was always good at deflecting, always good at getting people to feel sorry for him, but there was no one left to manipulate now. The officer handed over the documents to Mom, who reluctantly took them, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. Her eyes skimmed over the words, her face slowly falling as she read. Dad moved to look over her shoulder, his face hardening as the realization hit him too. You can't be serious," Mom whispered, her voice cracking. This isn't real." "Oh, it's real," I said, my voice steady. "Every word of it." Dad snapped his gaze to me, his eyes narrowing, his jaw clenched. "You had this planned all along, didn't you?" He spat, his voice rising with anger. "You think you've won? You think this makes you some kind of hero?" "No," I replied, my voice quiet but firm. "This doesn't make me a hero. It makes me someone who finally learned how to say no. It makes me someone who understands what boundaries are. Mom turned away, her face crumpling as if she were about to break down, but she held it together, barely. I could see the war raging inside her. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being called out like this, not by me. She had spent so many years making me feel like I owed her everything. But now, the tables had turned. I didn't want this, she said softly, almost to herself. I just wanted to help. I shook my head. You didn't want to help, Mom. You wanted to take. You always have. The truth hit her like a punch to the stomach, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before: regret. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough to undo the years of manipulation. Dad stood up suddenly, his chair scraping across the floor as he shoved it back with force. This is your fault, he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. You're the one who's ruined this family. You think you're better than us now, don't you? I stood my ground. I don't think I'm better than you, Dad. But I do think I'm done being your punching bag. I'm done being your scapegoat. I'm done letting you take from me. He took a step toward me, his face red with rage. But before he could say another word, the officer stepped in, blocking his path. Sir, I suggest you calm down, the officer said, his tone cold and professional. This is not the time or place for threats. You'll have your chance to respond in court. I could see it then. The realization was sinking in. This wasn't a game anymore. This was real. And they were on the losing side. Dad stood there for a moment, his chest heaving with anger, but there was no fight left in him. He looked defeated, drained. Finally, he slumped back into his chair, his eyes averted. Take them, I said, nodding toward the officer. They need to face the consequences of their actions. The officer gave a short nod. He turned to my parents. You'll receive further instructions. A court date will be set. For now, this is just the beginning. With that, the officer turned and left, Dana following closely behind them. The door closed behind them, and the apartment felt different now. Lighter. As if the weight of years of manipulation had been lifted off my shoulders. I stayed where I was, standing in the kitchen, breathing deeply. It wasn't over. Not yet, but I could feel it, the shift. The moment I had finally taken control. My parents didn't say another word. They sat in silence, still stunned, still processing what had just happened. I didn't feel sorry for them. Not anymore. And then, for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed them anything. Not a single thing. The silence in the apartment was thick, heavier than it had ever been before. My parents didn't say a word, not one single word. They sat across from me, their faces pale and stunned, their eyes blank with disbelief. I could see their minds working, trying to process what had just happened, but there was no way to reverse it. There was no going back. I had never seen them so powerless. It was almost strange to see them like this, sitting there, unable to manipulate the situation to their advantage, unable to make me feel guilty or obligated to do their bidding. All the years of conditioning, all the moments when they had twisted my sense of responsibility into something toxic, were finally unraveling. It felt surreal, but at the same time, it felt like a weight was lifting off me. I didn't feel sorry for them. Not anymore. They had crossed a line that they couldn't uncross. They had gone too far, and now the consequences were here. I glanced at the envelope still lying on the table, the document that had exposed them. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the result of years of emotional manipulation, years of guilt trips, years of being made to feel like I owed them something for simply existing. But now, in front of me, it was just a piece of paper that had shifted the balance of power between us. The doorbell rang again, breaking the silence. My heart skipped a beat as I moved toward the door, unsure of what to expect. I hadn't been expecting anyone else, but there they were, standing. When I opened the door, Dana was there, looking as calm and collected as ever, her sharp coat still pristine despite the drama that had unfolded. But this time, she wasn't alone. A woman in a police uniform stood beside her, holding a folder. I didn't need to ask what was going on. The officer stepped forward, holding the folder out to me, and I took it without hesitation. There were no more words needed. I could feel the tension in the room shift again as I closed the door behind them. The officer was polite, professional, but there was something unyielding in her demeanor. This is the next step in the process, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. You've received the appropriate legal documentation, And now, it's time for your parents to be fully informed of the legal consequences of their actions. I could hear my parents behind me, their voices low, but I didn't turn to look. I didn't need to. They were still processing the reality of what was happening. They were too proud, too used to being in control, to admit that they had lost. The officer handed me the folder and left with Dana, leaving me alone with my parents again. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't the same heavy silence of tension and fear. It was the silence of something having broken, something irreversible. I looked at my parents, the people who had raised me, but never supported me, the people who had taught me that love came with a price. They were still sitting at the table, their faces unreadable, but I could see the cracks beginning to show. They had always tried to paint themselves as victims, as the ones who had given everything to raise me, but now, there was nothing left to hide behind. They had always believed that they could manipulate me into submission, but that had never worked. Not really. Not in the long run. I had always known there was something off about the way they treated me, something that went beyond love and care. It was control. It was power, and now that power had slipped through their fingers. Mom looked at me, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You don't understand, Toby," she said, her voice tight. "We were just trying to help. You don't understand how hard things have been for us." I felt a cold, almost numbing kind of anger at her words. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't acknowledging anything she had done. She wasn't even trying to understand what had gone wrong. She was still the same person, trying to play the victim, trying to make me feel responsible for her choices. I shook my head. "No, Mom. You're not the victim here. You don't get to play that card anymore." Dad, sitting beside her, didn't say anything. He didn't have to, his silence was loud enough, he knew I was right. But he couldn't bring himself to admit it. Not to me. Not to anyone. The room felt so small suddenly, like everything was closing in on me, suffocating me. I hadn't realized how much weight I had been carrying around until now. I looked down at the folder in my hands, the papers inside, and I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. The moment I finally stood up for myself. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their love, not the way they had always given it to me, conditional, manipulative, and self-serving. I had found my own way, and I wasn't going to let them destroy that, not anymore. Without saying another word, I stood up, walked to the counter, and started making myself a cup of coffee. I didn't need to say anything else to them. The decision had already been made. The truth had already been laid out. And it was time for me to move on. The rest of the evening passed in silence. They didn't leave. They didn't say goodbye. They just sat there, lost in their own thoughts, while I went about my evening, my new life slowly taking shape. I didn't feel bad about it. I didn't feel guilty. I was free. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I expected. The morning was bright, the sun casting long shadows on outside my apartment. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my collar, trying to steady the flutter in my chest. It was hard to shake the feeling that this was it. This was the day everything changed. My parents were about to be held accountable for everything they'd done, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. But as I looked at myself in the mirror, I knew that I had no choice but to face it. I had to be strong, not just for myself, but for the person I had become, the person I was proud of. I had fought too hard to get here to let this moment slip by. I had spent the night preparing myself for this, mentally, emotionally. Dana had already briefed me on the details of the court proceedings. It wasn't going to be a long process, but it was going to be intense. The evidence was stacked against my parents, and there was no way out for them now. But I couldn't let myself get too comfortable. This was going to be a battle, and I had to stay focused. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. The streets of the city were still quiet, the world still waking up, but I was wide awake, every nerve alive with anticipation. I drove to the courthouse in a daze, my mind buzzing with thoughts of what was to come. The courtroom was cold and sterile, like everything inside had been designed to strip away emotion and leave only facts. It felt like a battlefield, but I wasn't scared. Not anymore. When I walked into the courtroom, I immediately saw my parents sitting at one of the tables. They were hunched over, their faces pale and drawn. Mom had red eyes like she hadn't slept for days, and Dad was staring at the floor, his hands clenched in his lap. They looked like two people who had lost everything, and I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for them. Not anymore. They hadn't expected me to be this strong. They hadn't expected me to fight back. They thought they could just waltz in, make their demands, and get away with it. But I wasn't the same person who had left home all those years ago. I had found my voice, and I was done being their victim. I took my seat beside Dana, who gave me a reassuring smile. She had been my rock throughout all of this. I couldn't have asked for a better ally. She had walked me through everything: how to prepare for the hearing, what to expect, what questions would be asked. She was calm, collected, and ready for whatever came our way. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood. I watched as the judge took his seat, his expression serious. He was an older man, his gray hair neatly combed back, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He looked like he had seen it all, and I could tell by the way he scanned the room that he wasn't interested in anyone's sob story. He wanted the truth, and so did I. The proceedings began, and I could feel the tension building in my chest. My parents' lawyer stood up first, trying to make his case. He talked about my parents' supposed financial difficulties, their hardship, and how they had always been there for me. But I knew it was all a lie. I knew that the only hardship they'd ever faced was the one they had created for themselves by manipulating me into taking care of them. Dana was the first to speak in my defense. She was calm and composed, laying out the facts in a way that left no room for doubt. She presented the notarized document I had kept safe for years, the one that absolved me of any financial responsibility to my parents. It was clear, it was concise, and it was exactly what we needed to prove that my parents had no claim to my money. But it wasn't just the document that mattered, it was the truth. The truth that my parents had submitted fraudulent evidence, falsifying messages from me, trying to make it seem like I had promised to send them money every month. Dana laid it all out for the judge, showing the fake messages and the phone records that proved they had fabricated everything. The judge's expression hardened as he listened, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. And then, as if the universe was giving me one final moment of clarity, my grandmother walked into the courtroom. She was slow, using a cane to steady herself, but when she stepped up to the stand, she was clear and strong. Her voice cut through the silence like a knife. Jessica asked for nothing from these two. She said, her eyes sweeping over my parents. She left home at 18 and built her own life. They never supported her. They drained her. She owes them nothing. I could see my mother's face twist, and my father's fists clenched in anger. But there was nothing they could do. The truth was out. My grandmother's words were a final blow to their defense. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He glanced at the documents, then at my parents, and then back at me. He looked at the evidence, he looked at the truth, and he made his decision. Given the fraudulent evidence, the lack of demonstrated hardship, and the testimony provided, he said, his voice steady, this petition is dismissed. Furthermore, the court is imposing a fine for the submission of falsified materials. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The fight was over. My parents' case had been dismissed, and they were the ones left exposed. I looked at them, sitting there in stunned silence, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet victory. Dana squeezed my arm, and for a brief moment, I let myself feel it. It wasn't a loud, triumphant victory. It was quiet, internal, but it was mine. It was the victory of standing up for myself when I had spent years being told I didn't matter. As we left the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting a soft, golden light across the city. I felt the weight of the day lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying their burdens anymore. I was free. My parents didn't speak to me on the way out. They didn't try to apologize. They just stood there, frozen on the courthouse steps, defeated, unable to do anything but watch as I walked away. And as I stepped out into the world, I realized something. This wasn't just the end of a legal battle. This was the beginning of something new, something all my own. The days after the hearing felt oddly quiet. The city outside my apartment was alive as ever, but within these walls it was different. There was a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the kind of peace that came with time or distraction. It was the kind that came with closure. My parents were no longer a part of my daily life. their voices no longer lingering in my head, their expectations no longer weighing me down. I had spent so much of my life trying to make them happy, trying to fulfill their demands, trying to do what I thought was right. And now I was free. Free from the emotional debt they'd tried to impose on me, free from the constant guilt and obligation that had shaped my every decision. I had finally reclaimed my life. It wasn't easy. The first few days were filled with moments of disbelief, as if I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it didn't. The phone calls stopped. The knocks on the door ceased. And for the first time, I wasn't checking my phone to see if they had sent a message. I wasn't bracing myself for some new demand or emotional manipulation. It was quiet. I sat in my apartment, staring out at the city skyline, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. I could finally focus on what I wanted, not what they wanted from me. I could finally live for myself. There were moments when the silence felt heavy, when I found myself questioning if I had done the right thing. Was it right to cut them out of my life completely? Was I being too harsh? I wondered if they'd ever realize how much they had hurt me. If they'd ever regret the way they'd treated me. But every time I thought about it, I reminded myself that I wasn't the one who had crossed that line. They were. They had made me feel small for years. They had used me. And now, they were reaping the consequences of their actions. I didn't feel guilty anymore. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I was stronger for standing up for myself. That was something they had never taught me. The importance of setting boundaries, of protecting myself from the people who were supposed to love me. They had always taught me that love meant sacrifice. That it meant giving everything you had, even if it meant losing yourself. But I had learned the hard way that real love, real self-respect was about knowing when to say no. And I had said it. I got a call from Dana later that week. Her voice was calm, steady, like always. She had been there every step of the way, helping me navigate through all the legal battles, offering support when I needed it most. "You did good, Toby," she said. "You stood up for yourself and you won. You're free now." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had known that this journey was important, that it was about reclaiming my life, but hearing someone else say it out loud made it feel real. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was the first step in a completely new chapter of my life. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I told her, "It feels like everything happened so fast." "Yeah," she replied, "but sometimes that's what it takes to break free. It's like a weight lifting off your shoulders, right?" I smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. Exactly. After I hung up, I took a moment to just sit there, in the quiet of my apartment. I had no more guilt, no more anger, no more fear of what might come next. My future was finally my own to shape. The next week, I received a letter. It wasn't from my parents. I had stopped expecting anything from them. But it was from my grandmother. She had been a silent figure in the background of my life, never pushing, never demanding, but always present in the way that mattered most. Inside the card was a short note, handwritten in neat, elegant script. "You chose truth over fear. I'm proud of you." For a second, I just held the card, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything I needed. My grandmother had always been the one to show me what real love looked like: love without expectations, love without strings attached. She had never made me feel like I owed her anything, and now her quiet approval felt like the final piece of the puzzle. I knew I had made the right choice. A few days later, I received another letter. This one was another letter. It was a thin envelope, and when I opened it, I could already feel my stomach tighten. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Instead, there was a list: medical complaints, emotional appeals, and a request for money to help them through a difficult time. It was everything I had expected, and yet, I felt nothing. I folded the letter once, then again, until it fit neatly back into the envelope. I stood there for a moment, holding it in my hands, feeling no anger, no sadness. Just a quiet, steady certainty. I didn't need to read it. I didn't need to respond. I had already said everything I needed to say when I stood up for myself in that courtroom. With a slow, deliberate motion, I walked over to the trash can and dropped the envelope inside. I didn't even glance at it again. A week later, another unexpected call came through. This time, it was from Dana again, but the tone of her voice was different. She sounded more serious, more somber. "I need to let you know, Toby," she said carefully. "Your grandmother passed away. She went peacefully in her sleep." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't expected it. I hadn't been prepared for this. But I wasn't blindsided by grief. I was struck by the sudden emptiness of it, the feeling that something precious had slipped away without warning. I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed quiet. But Dana understood. "I'll be here if you need anything," she added softly. The days after that were a blur. My grandmother's small house in Greensburg was left to me in her will, and I went there a few days later to sort through things. It was a quiet place, simple but comforting. The house had an old smell to it, the kind of smell that only time can create: wood, dust, memories. I could have kept it. I could have lived there, started over in a new place, a new life. But that wasn't what my grandmother would have wanted. She had always been practical, always looking out for me in quiet ways, never asking for anything in return. So, I made the decision to sell it. The money went to a local charity that helped women recovering from financial abuse. It felt right. It felt like something my grandmother would have done. Something I could be proud of. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I found a new apartment downtown, one with a view of the river. It wasn't big, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture I bought, every lamp I set up, every book I placed on the shelf, it all felt like an achievement. It felt like freedom. I spent a lot of time sitting by the window, watching the city stretch out before me. The lights glimmering on the water at night, the hum of traffic in the distance, it was all strangely comforting. For the first time, I wasn't replaying old arguments in my head. I wasn't bracing myself for the next emotional attack. I was simply living. And for the first time in my life, I was free. I woke up to the soft light of morning spilling through my window, the city skyline just visible in the distance. It was the kind of peaceful morning I had always wanted but never truly experienced. I lay there for a moment, just listening to the world outside, distant traffic, the faint hum of the city waking up, birds chirping in the trees. It was quiet in a way that felt completely different from the silence I had known before. This wasn't a silence filled with anxiety or dread. This was a calm I had earned. For years I had lived with a kind of tension, always waiting for the next demand, the next guilt trip, the next emotional manipulation from my parents. I had spent so much of my life questioning whether I was doing enough, whether I was a good enough son, whether I owed them everything. But now, I knew the truth. I didn't owe them anything, not anymore. I rolled out of bed and walked to the kitchen, the same one I had spent countless mornings in. But this time, it felt different. I had made this space my own. There was no one here telling me what I should do or what I should feel. Everything in this apartment, the furniture, the way it was decorated, the way the light filtered through the windows, felt like it belonged to me. Not just in a physical sense, but in a deeper, more emotional way. I had built this. It was mine, and it wasn't going anywhere. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. After the hearing, I didn't hear from my parents. At first, I kept expecting the phone to ring, expecting a message or some kind of desperate apology. But nothing came. And as the days passed, I realized I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. I wasn't waiting for their approval or their demands. I wasn't holding my breath for their next move. I was free. But there were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, when their absence felt heavier than I expected. I had spent so much of my life trying to make them proud, trying to be the son they wanted me to be. And now that I had broken free, I realized that part of me still wanted that validation. But I quickly reminded myself that it wasn't mine to seek anymore. I had spent too long chasing their approval, and it had come at the cost of my own peace. I spent the next few days taking care of things, finalizing the sale of my grandmother's house, settling into my new routine. I spent a lot of time walking around the city, letting the quiet hum of Pittsburgh settle into my bones. It felt like a new beginning, but it wasn't just the city that was new. It was me. I moved forward without looking back, without wondering what my parents would think or say. I had made my choice, and now there was nothing left to regret. A few weeks later, I received a letter. I didn't expect it. I wasn't sure what I thought it would be, maybe an apology, maybe an attempt to reopen the lines of communication. But it wasn't from my parents. It was from my grandmother. She had always been the steady presence in my life, the one person who never made me feel like I owed her anything. She was always kind, always understanding, never pushing. The letter was simple, just a short note in her neat handwriting. You chose truth over fear. I'm proud of you. I held the letter in my hands, feeling a wave of emotion wash over me. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that until I read it. My grandmother, the woman who had shown me what unconditional love really looked like, had always been there for me, even when it felt like no one else was. Her words were the validation I had been searching for, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't about her approving of my choices. It was about her acknowledging that I had finally chosen myself. I felt a sense of closure with the letter. It wasn't the kind of dramatic closure you see in movies, but it was quiet and profound. It was the kind of closure that allowed me to move on without guilt, without feeling like I had done something wrong. A few days later, I received another letter. This one was from my mother. At first, I felt a tightness in my chest as I opened it. I didn't know what to expect, but I was bracing myself for something. But as I read the letter, I realized it was just more of the same. A list of complaints, a request for money. No acknowledgement of what had happened, no apology, no recognition of the fraud or the lies. Just a plea for money, wrapped in guilt. I folded the letter carefully, not in anger, but in resignation. I didn't need to read it. I didn't need to engage with it. I had already made my decision, and it wasn't one I was going to change. I placed the letter back in the envelope and walked over to the trash can. I dropped it in without a second thought, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. It felt strange, this sense of finality. But it also felt right. That same week, I received a call that I wasn't ready for. It was Dana, but her voice was different this time, softer, almost hesitant. I need to let you know, Toby, she said, her tone careful. Your grandmother passed away in her sleep. The words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't known she was unwell, and the suddenness of it left me reeling. But in the days that followed, I realized something. My grandmother had lived a life filled with kindness and grace. She had always been a source of stability for me, a quiet example of how to live without expectation. And now, she was gone. But even in her passing, she left me something valuable, something my parents never covered: the ability to let go, to move forward without being weighed down by the past. A few weeks later, I went to the small home near Greensburg that my grandmother had left me. It was a simple place, a cozy cottage tucked away in the hills. I could have kept it, could have turned it into a new chapter of my life, but I knew deep down that this wasn't my path. It was hers. I sold the house and donated the proceeds to a local charity for women recovering from financial abuse. It felt like the right thing to do, and for the first time, I felt at peace with every decision I had made. I moved into a new apartment in downtown Pittsburgh, one with a view of the river. It wasn't big, but it was mine. Every item I bought for it, every small change I made, was a declaration of my independence. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to look over my shoulder. I didn't have to wonder if my parents would show up, demanding more from me. I walked to the river one evening, feeling the cool breeze against my skin. The water moved slowly, purposefully, like it had all the time in the world. And maybe, for the first time, so did I. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, quietly earned, unburdened, and that was enough. Have you ever had to choose peace over guilt? Have you ever had to protect yourself from the people who should have loved you best? If so, tell me your story in the comments. And if you want more stories about courage and reclaiming your life, make sure to subscribe,